There is almost no movement in this untitled photograph by Helen Levitt made in New York City around 1937. A young boy crouches on the sidewalk. One hand touches the pavement, while the other holds a piece of chalk. Around him, pale lines spread loosely across the concrete surface. Circles, rough figures, fragments of improvised drawings, already beginning to fade into the texture of the sidewalk itself. The child is completely absorbed in what he is doing. He does not look toward the camera, and beyond him, the city continues almost indifferently beyond the frame. The buildings rise close to the sidewalk, and doorways open directly onto the street. The pavement feels worn, darkened by time and constant use. Nothing here appears monumental or carefully staged. It feels like an ordinary New York block during the late 1930s, photographed quietly and without emphasis. And like much of Helen Levitt's work, the picture unfolds slowly. Nothing is pushed forward too quickly, as if the photograph was asking us to remain with it for a while. At first, the scene can seem almost simple, a child drawing with chalk on the pavement. But the longer we stay with the picture, the more the sidewalk itself begins to change. What normally functions as a surface for circulation briefly becomes something else, a place of attention, concentration, and improvisation. The child is not simply passing through the city. He is temporarily reshaping a small portion of it through the act of drawing. And that small transformation matters, because sidewalks are usually spaces people cross without noticing very much at all. Here, though, movement slows down. The child remains close to the ground, fully concentrated on the marks forming beneath his hands, while the city continues moving around him. One of the remarkable things about Helen Levitt's photography is the seriousness with which she observed these kinds of moments. She photographed children often, though never sentimentally. What interested her was not innocence in some idealized sense, but behavior, improvisation, and the unstable theater of everyday life unfolding in the street. Children appear constantly in Levitt's photographs because they moved through the city differently from adults. They climbed onto stoops, leaned across railings, disappeared into alleyways, transformed sidewalks into games or temporary stages. In many of her photographs, you can feel urban space becoming flexible, for a while, shaped by gestures that are spontaneous, temporary, and often collective. This photograph belongs very much to that attention. What begins to matter here is not so much the drawing itself, but the way the sidewalk gradually changes meaning while the child remains there. The pavement becomes a surface capable of holding attention, memory, and presence for a while. And maybe this is one of the places where the photograph connects most closely to walking, because walking also changes our relationship to space. Once we begin paying attention while moving through a city, certain corners become familiar. Certain walls or surfaces begin carrying traces of memory almost without us noticing. Of course, the chalk marks themselves will disappear quickly. Rain will wash them away. People will walk across them. By the next day, they may already be gone. But Levitt's photograph remains very close to that brief interval before disappearance. Helen Levitt began photographing seriously in New York during the 1930s, during a moment when photography itself was also changing. Small portable cameras like the Leica allowed photographers to move much more freely through the city and respond directly to gestures unfolding in public space. One important turning point for Levitt came after encountering the work of Henri Cartier-Bresson, whose photographs showed how ordinary life in the street could become the material of serious photographic attention. You can still feel some of that influence in Levitt's work. the responsiveness to movement, the attentiveness to fleeting gestures, though her photographs eventually developed in a quieter direction, less dependent on dramatic timing, more open to duration, ambiguity, and social texture. During the late 1930s, Levitt spent long periods walking through working-class neighborhoods in New York, especially in Spanish Harlem, the Lower East Side, and Brooklyn. She photographed stoops, entrances, sidewalks, windows, children gathering in the street. The city she moved through was still deeply marked by the Great Depression, a period of severe economic hardship that had transformed everyday life across the city. Many neighborhoods were overcrowded and economically unstable, but Levitt rarely approached these realities through spectacle or overt social commentary. Her photographs remain remarkably observant instead. They stay close to gestures unfolding inside ordinary life without insisting too heavily on explanation. And that restraint changes the rhythm of the photos themselves. They breathe differently. They leave room for uncertainty, drift, and small details that might otherwise disappear. The mobility of the camera mattered enormously here too. Earlier photographic equipment often required heavier setup and more fixed positions, but photographers working in the 1930s could now move through the city much more lightly. Levitt's photographs often feel shaped by that mobility. The camera does not seem imposed on the street from outside. It feels embedded within the rhythm of the neighborhood itself, moving at walking pace, attentive to what appears briefly and then vanishes again. So, looking at this photograph today, it is difficult not to notice how different the child's relationship to the street can feel compared to contemporary urban life. The sidewalk still functions here as a social space. Children gather there, spend time there, invent things together. The threshold between apartment and street remains porous. People spill outward into public space, and children especially seem deeply connected to the physical environment around them. This does not mean the city was necessarily safer or easier. Romanticizing the past too heavily would flatten the complexity of the period. Still, the photograph preserves a certain openness in the use of urban space, a looseness that allowed for more spontaneous occupation of the street than we often encounter today. And in some ways, this episode also continues ideas that have been emerging gradually through recent episodes of photography and walking. In the previous episode, we looked at Gabriele Orozco pushing a plasticine sphere through the streets of New York. There, too, the city became responsive to movement. Surfaces accumulated traces. Contact slowly registered itself onto an object moving through urban space. Here, with Helen Levitt, everything becomes much quieter and smaller in scale. There is no formal artwork being presented to us, only a child drawing with chalk on the pavement. Yet, some of the underlying questions remain surprisingly close. What happens when someone begins using the city differently, even briefly? How do ordinary gestures alter the meaning of a space for a short period of time? And what kind of traces do people leave behind simply through the way they inhabit the world? Levitt never answers those questions directly. The photograph simply remains close to the moment in which they begin appearing. And the picture also sits interestingly beside the episode that will follow, because Richard Long's walking works often involve inscriptions too. Lines traced across landscapes, paths slowly formed through repeated movement, temporary marks left on the ground. But while Long moves outward into open landscapes, Levitt remains inside the density of the city. Her attention stays close to sidewalks, walls, thresholds, crowds, and neighborhoods, close to the improvisations of everyday urban life. And perhaps that is one of the enduring powers of photography. Not to stop time completely, but to remain near certain gestures long enough for us to sense what they carried before disappearing again. You've been listening to Photography and Walking. I'm Philippe. You can find related images and references at photographyandwalking.com, and if you'd like to receive occasional notes connected to the episodes, you can leave your email through the contact page on the website. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.